Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about the costs of homeschooling, and hopefully I can help parents who have never worked in school administration to understand how the costs of schooling are figured and how this applies to educating your own children at home. One of the important things for parents to realize is that when you choose to homeschool your children, you're not simply keeping your children home from school. That's not what homeschooling is. When you choose to homeschool your children, you choose to create a school in your home. Homeschooling is a legal form of schooling, and when parents choose to start a homeschool, they are the administrators of their homeschool, not merely the parents of the children who are studying, but also the legal administrators of their own school. And many homeschool families don't take that seriously. And I think homeschool parents need to learn to take that administrative part of homeschooling more seriously if homeschooling is going to become more effective and fulfill its potential. Now, I want to talk about finances with homeschooling because it's very important for parents to understand a few principles about planning and managing the operation of a homeschool. And there are a few principles that I'd like to share that I think will be helpful. First of all, I'd like to talk about tuition rates. When you look at the tuition information for a private school or a boarding school or a college or university, you have to wonder, where does that tuition come from? Where do those tuition numbers come from? Sometimes they seem insane. You may be looking at a private boarding school and see that the tuition is $50,000 per student per year, and you may look at that and wonder, how in the world can anyone afford that? Because you may imagine that that number is given as the price for attending the school, as if people write checks to pay that tuition, and that's not how tuition works. It's not that simple. The same is true of colleges and universities, all private schools, and so on. Now, where those tuition numbers come from are the budgets of those schools. So the schools will think about what they want their school program to offer. They'll think about all the different resources they need, all the different personnel they need, supplies, facilities, all the different costs to carry out the program that they'd like to make available. And then what they'll do, once they get that total cost of operation, they'll divide it by the number of students that they'd like to host at the school. And that number, the total costs divided by the number of students, gives us this tuition number. Now, the school doesn't expect parents to be able to afford that tuition, and that's really not what the tuition is for. That tuition is simply a number that's used to work by the school to consider its budget and its cost of education per student, because that figures into all different programs and resources that they then tap into to find ways to cover the costs of the operation of their schools. So for example, let's say that we were to find that it was going to cost $1 million to operate a school that was going to host 1,000 students. Well, we would take that number, the cost of operation, $1 million, divided by 100 students, and then that would give us our tuition rate for the school. Once we have that number, we can post that number on our website and in our promotional materials, because that number says something about the quality of the program that we're going to offer. When I look and see that the tuition for a school is $40,000 per year, that makes me think, this school must really have some great things planned for these students. They must have some great facilities, great faculty, great resources, and so on, because the tuition, the cost of education is high for these students. And if I look at another program and see that the tuition is very low, I have to be careful and consider whether or not the school is going to offer a quality program for the children based on what they're claiming to be their cost of education. So the tuition, we would hope that the tuition is high, because that suggests high quality of services and resources that are going to be available to the students. But we have to look into those numbers and try to figure out what's included and whether it's actually addressing the real concerns of education, or if it's just a bunch of fluff that's intended to attract attention and maybe even lure some wealthier parents who the school thinks will be able to write those checks. But once the schools have those tuition numbers figured out, they can post those numbers, but then they can start to look at a number of different sources where they can find that tuition from. It could be through fundraisers and donations. That can be used to cover the costs of those tuition numbers. They can apply for grants and different financial aid resources that are available. They could develop payment plans or allow students to make use of student loans and things like that. So there's a lot of different sources for that money once those numbers are established. Now, the reason why I'm sharing this is because when you sit down as a homeschool parent, you have to do this same play with numbers here. You have to determine what the program is that you want to offer your children, your own children in your homeschool. You have to figure out what the goals are, what's needed to accomplish those goals, what that's going to cost. Divide that by the number of children in your homeschool and look at that and say, that's what it's going to cost us for the education of these children. And then as a private homeschooling parent, you've got to figure out how you're going to come up with that money for those resources and plans. So that's how this work with tuition and calculating numbers works. We start with the plan that we'd like to make available, and then we calculate its cost and we divide that by the number of students, and that gives us the cost of education per student, which is a significant number. As homeschool administrators, you need to be willing to do that work. You need to learn to look at your school as an educational institution. Even though it's in your own home, you need to look at the program just as school administrators would look at a program and count the costs, as it were, and figure out whether your goals can be achieved at the cost you've set, or whether you're spending too much money and not focusing on the goals, as some people do, or whether you're not counting the costs of what those goals are really going to take for you to accomplish them, and that leads you to failure in your homeschool by trying to keep costs lower than is possible based on your goals. So we have to deal with those numbers. We have to start with our goals and then consider what it's going to cost to accomplish those goals. And then we either need to adjust our goals to match the costs that we can afford, or we need to increase our costs to match those goals. So that's the challenge of managing a private school, and more specifically of managing a homeschool. Now, one of the principles that I want to share comes from the New Testament. Jesus teaches a principle. He says, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows abundantly will reap abundantly. And this is a simple principle of business of any kind. He who sows sparingly will reap sparingly. He who sows abundantly will reap abundantly. In modern business, you might hear the phrase, you have to spend money to make money. That there's no way to generate income, there's no way to do business without investing some cost, some expense in order to create something of value and then be able to take that thing that you've created, that product or service, and offer it to others to generate revenue. You have to spend money to make money, and there's this constant balance between costs and benefits. And this is the reality that we face in homeschooling. We've got to consider this balance between costs and benefits. One of the things that I think plagues homeschooling is that there are a number of false ideas in the minds of many homeschool families, and this leads them into many troubles. One of the ideas is parents think that by homeschooling they can save money. They think that they're going to save money by homeschooling as opposed to sending children to a local private school. They look at the private school tuition, often not understanding what that number really means. They look at that tuition number and they say, we can't afford that. We have 6 children. The tuition is $10,000 per year. How can we afford to pay $50,000, $60,000 a year in tuition? We can't do that. So we're going to homeschool, as if homeschooling is going to be cheaper. Now, homeschooling may be cheaper, but the problem is that if a parent doesn't have the resources, the knowledge, the ability to do the work himself or herself, they're going to have to either leave that work undone or pay to have that work done. If they think that they're going to do it more cheaply in their own home, I think most of the time they're going to be in for a rude awakening, and what's going to happen is they're not going to be able to accomplish their goals, and they're going to have to water those goals down until they finally come to a level where the parents are capable of doing those things and quote-unquote saving money. So that's the dilemma in homeschooling, and I very often hear homeschooling parents, especially young parents getting into homeschooling, talking about how they're going to save money by homeschooling. And I just want to warn you that often the only way that you can save money by homeschooling is by lowering the goals. And so we have to be careful, because if we sow sparingly, we're also going to reap sparingly. And if we want to reap abundantly, we can't sow sparingly. We have to sow abundantly. So that's a challenge that I think homeschooling families need to take more seriously. Just because you can articulate goals and talk about goals and talk about raising saints and doing better than schools do and giving a classical education, you can talk the talk, but walking that walk is actually very difficult work. And I really don't believe you're going to be able to achieve the goals of classical Catholic homeschooling by spending less than you would to send your kids to a local private school. You can't get into homeschooling with some idea that you're going to save money unless you're going to give your children a bottom-of-the-barrel education, barely satisfying minimum requirements. So I want to challenge homeschool parents to consider, if they have noble goals in homeschooling, whether or not they have realistic expectations for what the cost of that educational program is going to be. Because like I said, I think many homeschool families have very unrealistic expectations about what they're going to accomplish and the price at which they're going to accomplish it. So keep in mind that idea about how private schools calculate the cost of education. They start with goals. They think about what it would take to accomplish those goals, calculate all the costs of such a program, and then divide that by the number of students to come up with a tuition or cost of education per student, and then understand that if we're going to reap abundantly, we have to sow abundantly, that there's just no other way around it. Unless you are an amazingly gifted and skilled parent and can do all of the work of classical Catholic education yourself, which I don't think is realistic, the costs are going to either creep up on you or come unexpectedly, or you're simply going to have to abandon those goals. So keeping the goals high is one thing, and we want to do that, but at the same time, we have to realize that there's a realistic cost for the achieving of those goals, and we can't just ignore that and pretend that we're going to beat the system and get all of that accomplished without sowing abundantly to do so. So we need to think realistically about that. I think most homeschool families do not have realistic plans as far as cost of education, and for many families, I think that they would do their children much better service as far as homeschooling is concerned by trying to make more money as a family and outsourcing academic work than by trying to do everything themselves and pretending that they're just going to save their way to some kind of renewal of Catholic culture, because that's just not how things work. If we go to the ethics of Aristotle, he talks about the means of obtaining happiness, and the question arises of whether or not it's necessary to have material resources in order to be happy, whether or not we need money to be happy. And in modern society, especially in modern Christian society, we often hear people say, no, you don't need any money to be happy. Money can't make you happy, and so on. But Aristotle argues that that's not true. That is not true. And we all know by experience that that's not true. There's a funny line in It's a Wonderful Life where George Bailey is about to kill himself, and he's saved by his guardian angel, Clarence. And George Bailey actually jumps into the river to save Clarence, who comes to save him. And then they're in this little, security shelter or something like that back up on the bridge, and they're drying off and warming up. And Clarence jokes as the angel that they have no need of money up in heaven. And George Bailey responds and says something like, well, it sure comes in handy down here. And that's the reality of Aristotle's teaching, that we can't have this silly attitude that money doesn't matter, that resources don't matter, you don't need money to be happy, and so on. That's actually not what moral philosophy teaches. What Aristotle teaches in the Ethics is that happiness comes through virtue, and virtue is expensive. Just take a minute and think about the works of mercy. The works of mercy, give food to the hungry, clothe the naked, give shelter to the homeless, on and on. All of these good works to be done. The work of the Good Samaritan, the Good Samaritan in the Gospel comes along, finds this Jewish man who's been beaten by robbers, and takes the Jewish man, brings him to an inn, gets him set up where he can recover, pays all of his expenses, and so on. That all sounds great, but that's an expensive act of mercy that the Good Samaritan carries out. You have to have resources to do those good deeds. You have to have food and clothing and housing and so on in order to do the works of mercy. So in classical moral philosophy, Aristotle explains that in order for us to be happy, we do need material resources, because we need to practice virtue in order to be happy, and we need material resources in order to practice virtue. So we have to beware of some of these irresponsible and lazy modern ideas that sort of mock any need for money or finances or financial planning or anything like that, and pretend that all we need is a good intention and roll up our sleeves and get to work and we can get all this stuff done. That's not true. That's not true. It's not responsible. In fact, one of the real challenges in Christian work is the fact that we have to find ways to solve problems that are financially sustainable. They have to be responsible. That's the real challenge. It's one thing to stand around and talk about good intentions and plans and goals. That's easy. It's just all idle talk. But to actually achieve those goals and do those things, the difficult part is not conceiving of the goals or even understanding how to do them. The hard part is the actual practical planning and working to make those things become realities, like starting a school. It's one thing to say, we need Catholic schools. That's true. It's one thing to say the modern schools aren't doing very well and we need better schools. Yeah, that's all easy, but to move from that idle talk and criticism to actually organizing and starting schools on the ground within the context of existing laws and costs of facilities and insurance and all these different realities, that's a very different challenge than merely talking about what needs to be done or what needs to be improved upon. The reality of the work is what requires the virtue to actually find ways to do these things lawfully and sustainably within the context of our own society. There are good examples of this if we look back into church history. If you look back at the lives of the saints and you look at the amazing practical works that they did. Look at Mother Teresa building orphanages. Look at Padre Pio building a hospital. Look at John Bosco building schools and taking care of street children. We can talk about the religious ideas behind their works. We can talk about the spiritual mission of the works that they did. And that's all easy talk. We can watch movies about the lives of the saints and say, oh, that's so nice what they did. Padre Pio is so wonderful. John Bosco is so kind. Mother Teresa is so sacrificial. That's all easy talk. But what we have to consider, and what I think makes the saints most amazing, is the fact that they carried out these spiritual works, and they managed all of the practical burdens and responsibilities that were necessary to actually accomplish those things in the real world. John Bosco had to figure out where to come up with bread and food for all those boys and find a place where they could have their catechism meetings and have their places to play games and teach the boys how to behave. And they had to find places to rent, and they were evicted from places, and they had no food at times. John Bosco was in trouble with local bakers and other workers because he couldn't come up with the money to pay the bills sometimes. And the saints bore all of that real-world practical stress and difficulty to accomplish the spiritual goals that drove the works that they undertook. And I think we often fail to think about how practical the saints were and how difficult the work was that they did. And as we talk about spiritual works in our own day, there's a lot of criticism, especially in modern social media Catholicism, where a bunch of idle laymen with free social media accounts sit around criticizing, leaders of the church. That's easy. Do something about it. Actually create a better school, create a better solution. That's what's difficult. That's the real challenge. And we don't see many people stepping up and taking on the responsibilities of actually creating sustainable businesses and schools and other institutions, but excusing themselves from that work because they say, well, I don't have the money to do that. Well, John Bosco didn't have the money either. Mother Teresa didn't have the money either. That's the whole challenge of that work. So the reason why I raise these issues is because if we're going to restore Catholic education, if we're going to restore classical Catholic education, we're going to have to take this real-world practical challenge more seriously. And we're going to have to plan education more realistically. We're going to have to start with the goals, figure out what it costs to accomplish those goals, and then spend our time working to figure out how to obtain the resources for those costs and thereby to accomplish the goals that we've set out according to those or by those means. We can set the goals, that's pretty easy, and the saints and wise men of the past have already given us an explanation of the means, a roadmap for how to achieve those goals. But I think we're greatly underestimating the cost, what it's going to cost us to do these things. And unless we're willing as the Catholic laity to become more practically minded, more financially responsible, more realistic, we're simply going to do a lot of talking and not accomplish these things. And so I want to encourage you as homeschool parents to think about the goals of the education you have, the education of your children, the goals you have for their education. Write those goals down and don't shrink back from those goals. But as you establish those goals and commit to those goals, think realistically about what it's going to cost to accomplish those goals. Think about what you need to accomplish those goals. Don't give up on those goals. Don't lower the standards and reduce your goals to merely getting kids through high school diplomas and into college and things like that. That's not the goal of Christian education. Don't let go of those Catholic goals for education, but be honest and realistic about what you need to do to accomplish those goals and what that's going to cost you. And you have to work that out until you have a dollar figure, figure established for what it's going to cost. And then the reality is that as parents, we have to figure out how to get that money or how to get those resources, how to get that help, and be able to do those things to accomplish those goals. I think many homeschool families are going to find that the problem in homeschooling is not that parents need to spend more time working on curriculum or lesson plans, but they need to be working to make more money because they have to obtain help. They have to improve the quality of the resources that they're using. They have to bring in the assistance of experts to help them manage the education of their children, or they're simply not going to be able to accomplish the goals that have been set. And the only way those goals are going to get established is not by parents working harder on homeschooling, but working harder to simply generate the material resources that they need to get help in that work of homeschooling. We can't accomplish more and more by simply trying to save more. We can't save our way to great achievements. The reality is we have to be willing to work as Catholic laymen in the world to direct temporal affairs according to God's will, and that costs money. It's difficult, challenging work, and that is the work of the Catholic laity, to engage with temporal affairs, to use wisdom and prudence to engage in affairs in a profitable or a gainful way, not selfishly and recklessly at the cost of other moral standards, but for the sake of those moral standards, to work to generate resources so that we can gain control of those material resources and invest them in the kinds of programs and resources that we need to actually accomplish these goals, to restore classical Catholic education and renew Catholic culture and so on. These things are not just a matter of figuring out what to do intellectually or making a list of goals on paper. We have to realize that the challenge in these works is that we have to do this stuff in the context of modern society, where there are regulations, there are costs, there's competition for resources, and so on. And it's very difficult work at the practical level to start a school or educate your children, to improve culture, and so on. We have to be more practically minded and realize that's why we're in the world as Catholic laymen. So I'd like to challenge homeschool families to count the costs, to sit down and list your goals, figure out what you would actually have to do, what you would actually need to accomplish those goals, and then realistically commit to doing whatever it takes to gain those resources that would allow you to do those things, that would allow you to accomplish those goals. Don't fall for this nonsense about how you're going to save money by homeschooling, or you can just keep coupon cutting and looking for bargains, or using used resources and throwing all of these crazy combinations of books and resources together. You're just garbage collecting. You're trying to save money on something that should not be, or I should say, you're trying to save money on something that should be a priority as far as your budget is concerned, not an issue you're trying to save money on. Marcus Aurelius, the great Roman philosopher, in his Meditations said that he learned from his grandfather that education was something that a man should invest in. And I think we as Christians have to realize that for us to achieve the goals that we're setting out to achieve, it's going to be a lot costlier than many of us thought it was. And that's one of the reasons why the standards have fallen. It's expensive and difficult. It's challenging for Christian people to engage in temporal affairs, but that's the mission of the laity, and we have to be willing to undertake that work. So I hope that's encouraging. If not encouraging, I hope that it's a warning to take this practical consideration more seriously, because I think we're underestimating the cost. We're not counting the costs of leading our children to the goals of real Catholic education, and our failure to count the costs realistically, our failure to come up with a plan for how we can achieve those goals, and then being willing to work to obtain whatever's needed to cover the costs of that plan. That's a work that I think we've failed to do as homeschooling parents, and one that we need to learn to give renewed attention to and take a lot more seriously. Our children don't just need more of us. They don't just need more time with their parents. They don't need more time reading. They don't need more books. There's a lot of higher level needs that our children have to get to the next level in Catholic learning and culture, and it's going to take a real strategic effort from Catholic parents, especially in modern society, to be able to get to that next level, and that has to be our challenge moving forward. I'm posting this to hopefully start a discussion about this topic. I spend my time thinking about it. I mean, you can imagine what it's cost me to develop the Classical Liberal Arts Academy through the years, and I still feel like we're nowhere near where we need to be. I see the plan, I see the steps to get there, but I don't think the Catholic laity is taking seriously enough the challenge we face to actually do this work in temporal matters, where we take things like generating honest Christian revenue, investing that revenue in education and cultural programs, and making those resources available for our kids, whether we do it privately as families or whether we do it collectively as a Catholic community. I think that there needs to be a much more strategic effort among Catholics to set the goals, lay out realistic plans, and then count the costs, and then find ways to come up with those resources so that we can sow abundantly and expect to reap abundantly. So I'd like to start that discussion. I invite you to send any thoughts or questions along that you may have as to how we can do that. I'm obviously working in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy to improve the quality of services that we can make available. I'm trying to make them as affordable as we can, but at the same time, there's just a reality of costs of these things. When you get into the practical details and the practical workings of these services and activities, there are just inescapable limitations that we have to work within, and that causes costs to go up, and we have to find solutions that are affordable but also realistic, and then we have to put the resources on the table in order to get those things done. And that's a real challenge for us. That really tests our sincerity and how committed to these goals we are, because it's easy to talk, as many do, but it's very difficult to actually build these things and accomplish these things. So if you'd like to take up this discussion with me and talk as Catholic parents and teachers and laymen in general about what we can do to improve the quality of Catholic education, especially in the context of homeschooling, which is where I really believe the future lies for most students, I invite you to get in touch, and let's get this discussion started and start to find solutions so that we can give our children the help and the resources they need. God bless.